Hi, everyone. Welcome to Joysticks, the podcast where I talk to game designers about the most joyful thing about making games for them. Today, I am joined by the incomparable Dr. Jason Cox, who is most famous for 500-Year-Old Vampire, What to Do About Michael, Mantles in the Museum with Dr. Lillian Lewis, and Cash and Crumbs. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Cox. So lovely to have you.
Hello.
So I will start this with the central thesis of this podcast, which is, what is the most joyful thing about making games for you?
You know what? It's other people. There's
Yeah.
the thing is that there's a lot about games to be joyful about, right? There's the escapism, there's the lore, there's playing with new ideas, there's Mary Flanagan talks about them as systems for making meaning or making reality. Uh, there's an infinite amount of things that you can love about games, but when you get down to it, all of them are some kind of social engagement. They're a playground, uh, and what happens in the game, from the simplest to the most complex, is dependent upon who's playing in that time in that place. These unique experiences, and they let us come together and make something that wasn't there before, no matter how many times that game's been played.
Um, so when you are making games, are you thinking about people in particular when you make them? Are you are you designing them with certain individuals in mind?
Sometimes, eventually, yes. I don't necessarily start that way. Sometimes I start with, what would be fun, what would be a good idea, what I would like. Um, but so there's this thing about design, about all kinds of art, which is that when you start off, you're always designing for yourself. That's your default audience. So one of the things I try to do is to actually decenter myself a little and to put myself in someone else's place. What they would need, what they might be interested in, how to make it accessible to people who are not me. So the audience absolutely comes into mind, especially because a lot of what I've worked on are educational games. And the educational games are kind of walking a very narrow tightrope. Um, the problem a lot of educational games have is they're either made by people who know a lot about education, but not a lot about games, in which case they don't tend to be very engaging. They're more systemic chores than anything else. Or you have someone who knows a lot about games and figures, I went to school, I don't really need to study education. In which case you have a very engaging game with questionable educational content. And trying to find a place where both of those things are present is a little bit tricky because you're trying to satisfy these external standards, the teachers, the administrators, all the people who are invested. At the same time, if it's not a game, if it's not fun to play, if it's not engaging, if there's not agency, uh, it's not going to be taking full advantage of what educational games can be. So those in particular, I do have to think about the specific audience that I'm calibrating for. Um, some other ones, I've written a number of freeform LARPs for, especially for Golden Cobra, which I know Banana had mentioned as well. I've never been a
Yeah,
winner the way they have, but
there's
but I
still time.
yeah, but I love Golden Cobra. I love seeing everything people come up with. But when you're putting things in there, you're not exactly sure whose hands it's going to go into. Um, Probably someone who knows something about freeform LARP, not necessarily, but they're going to take a chance on it. So you tend to lead with the concept, but you still have to make it accessible to people who will not be in the room with you, probably.
Possibly tangential to this, but a question, is there anything that you'd want to tell people about Freeform LARP that you wish you could tell them about Freeform LARP?
Oh man, it's not as scary as you think. It's
Sure.
so you know, I for years and years I was a tabletop only kind of person. But when I my first semester of my PhD program, I went into a local library and I was like, I'm just so tired of reading about arts and educational theory. I need to read something else. And front and center in the library was Leaving Mundania by Lizzie Stark. It was like new books this week. And so I picked it up. And I was like, perfect, something that has nothing to do with my studies. Became kind of the basic basis for my dissertation. Um, but part of that is because I had a fairly limited idea about what LARP could be. I'd experienced American Boff LARP. I thought it was interesting. Wasn't really for me. Um, but freeform LARP had a lot more fluidity. It let me explore ideas in a way that I hadn't before, really in any medium. Uh, it's introduced these new techniques, new ideas. Sometimes, sometimes you play two different freeforms that have diametrically opposing understandings of the world, and the conversation between them is part of the value. Is the decentering of perspective once again. Um, some of them are just fun. The most freeform LARPs are Emily Careboss told me that they were for the short, sharp shock. You know, they're designed to be relatively quick, but also have a high amount of emotion and a high amount of thought. Uh, they generally don't require much in the way of props. All they really need is two or three other people willing to do silly voices and pretend to be other people with you for a little while. And the the first barrier is asking someone else if they will do silly voices and hang out with you for a little while. But once you can get those, they're remarkably accessible. You don't need to pay huge sums like you do for a blockbuster. You don't have to have multiple books. You try them out, you see what happens. And for me, you also reflect on the experience. I'm keen on the reflection angle. Obsessive navel gazing is kind of my approach.
Do you find that a lot of your work around, I guess, pedagogy and games is part of, like, comes from the reflection or like retrospective process of that?
Absolutely. I mean, so first of all, the way that I tend to design classes is informed by my designing of games. Um, they're not necessarily games. Like I said, for one thing, the purpose isn't necessarily the same. There's the extrinsic motivators, things like grades, eventually a degree. You know, these things exist. I can't get around them.
Sure.
But I try to take a playful approach in my pedagogy. I'm broadly a constructivist and a contextualist, and the description of those words. Constructivist means you start with the understanding you have, you add information to build a new understanding from which you might build and build and build and build. Um, Although I'm doing this thing, I don't actually super love hierarchies and ladders. It tends to be more kind of the expansive rhizome approach in my case. And in the context, I would take a something Graham Sullivan says, which is as context change, meanings change. So an understanding you have can be challenged if you're in a different context. Like it doesn't necessarily, it's not as rock solid as it will appear. So sometimes to get at an idea, I'll change the perspective multiple times. So my teaching and my game design both kind of bring this into play. They also have, I've been thinking about recently, this kind of stone soup quality. And I've said that to a couple people who have then looked at me questioningly because they did not know stone soup, which to me means that I am real old. Uh, but but if you don't
At
know,
least as old as me.
uh, if you don't know Stone Soup, the general idea is that someone comes into town, doesn't have any food, but he starts like a soup with just a stone in it. And people are curious about this crazy soup he's making. He's like, "Oh, I'm making stone soup, but it could really use some salt." And like the ingredients he asked for get more and more comprehensive, and more add to it. And then at the end, you have this delicious soup that couldn't have existed without everybody bringing stuff in. But at the end, everyone's like, "Oh, and to think it was made from a single stone." But the nature of what I'm doing is collaborative. A teacher is a facilitator to a certain degree, even if you're not actually there. The game designer is a facilitator because you have to trust people to take your game, ideally in the spirit in which you wrote it, but you won't be there. You can't control it. The house rules will fly. So there's a lot of ingredients that are coming to the mix. And like I said at the beginning, the soup that you get at the end is dependent upon who's there at that time in that place.
Thinking- As you're saying this to me, and we're thinking about how essentially your classroom or the folks that you play games with sort of become this like imagined community almost. And
I
like,
I wouldn't say imagined. I would say temporary. Uh,
fair
yeah,
enough.
in my dissertation, I was specifically working with a group of educators that were using freeform to explore power in schools. And I use the term in that communities of play, but there are other people who use it differently, right?
Hmm,
Um, it's a term that varies again by context, but
sure.
it is absolutely for the time in which you're doing it. You have a temporary community. Um, the things that define a community are basically, in my opinion, two things, but there's big definitions I can use. So, a community is broadly defined by what they have in common. If you have the game in
Hmm.
common and you're there to play the game, you have a community. Uh, According to Bernie DeKoven, you all have to be playing a game with the same understanding of the rules. There are games where that's not the case, where there's someone who's secretly playing by a different set or something like that. But you have the people that are playing, and sometimes there's more things. They go to college together, they grew up together, what have you. Um, but then the other thing that I find actually defines a community is the points of difference. Because the thing you
Mhm.
have in common is what unites you. The points of difference show what you're capable of. If someone knows something about a given subject, it expands the overall potential of what can happen.
No one wants a tabletop party where everyone's the same class, that's for sure.
Yeah. And even if they were all the same, they still wouldn't all play the same, right?
Correct. Yeah. That's so interesting. I think eh, right now in the zeitgeist, everyone is sort of really focused on how can you contribute to your community?
Yeah.
How can you form community with others? How can you, um, how will your community save you? Right? Um, do you find that because I know personally in both intellectual and personal ways I have found games to create a community where I had found none previously. Do you in your um in your work as a person who is ultimately a facilitator of knowledge and of games possibly at the same time, finding that you are trying to create communities where there would not otherwise be them with your teachings about games?
A lot of the times. Sometimes what I'm trying to do is to make people aware of communities that they might not be aware of, or other points of view. Um, to make different, I said perspectives, but also communities accessible. The it is a thing, especially right now. One of the things that I've heard again and again is that the first thing you can do in the search for community is to just find people that you want to hang out with. It could be watching terrible movies in your basement. It could be playing games. Uh, and when you're together, then you have these social moments, and then around them, other things emerge and evolve. And I think about that a lot. The United Nations has this thing called UNESCO, which is about like cultural exchange, with the idea that cultural exchange between cultures that are not seeing eye to eye is part of what creates understandings. Although the United States does not, in fact, participate in that as a government
Oh, yeah.
because we don't want to send money to people that we're in conflict with. Um, but the concept is there, and there's certainly other variations of that. And I know that I personally, as I've built a fair amount of my identity around, in some sense, protecting people. I'm a father. I'm a teacher. I'm a lot of things, and I've been feeling a lot of stress right now. That there's a lot of people I care about. The more people I teach, the more people I play with, the
Yeah.
the broader a scope of people that I worry for, and I cannot protect them. I cannot do much. I can I can make a Facebook post and watch it get swallowed by the void. Um,
Yeah.
but what I've been trying to do is to make games that put more of what I want to see in the world. I've played games that are critiques of the world. I've written games that are critiques of the world, uh, and they're great. But it's not where I want to be right now. Um, I'm I'm more wanting to see, even if there's a touch of darkness, as in 500-Year-Old Vampire. Uh, at its core, in that game, you're making small, beautiful, handcrafted keepsakes for each
Yeah.
other. Like you're writing letters to each other, even though it's imaginary, and it's there. It's a series of gift giving over the course of a game about horrible eternal monsters. Uh, but but the where I am now, as an artist, teacher, designer, person, is I'm trying to find ways to put more hope, more connection, more ideas into the world. And one of the problems that I have with the critique games is that sometimes I can read them and get into them, but if someone's in too different a place philosophically from the critique offered by a game, then they won't pick up the game. They won't play the game. They won't engage with it. And if they don't engage with it, then what's the point? I'm just speaking to the choir. So,
Sure.
the accessibility is part of the question.
This is a question I was planning to ask you, but I feel that you are partially addressing it now, and I should just go full
So
force.
I tend to
No,
lecture.
it's great. It's amazing. Um, and ask you. Um, I'm really interested in the work of Rob Hopkins, and he wrote a book called How to Fall in Love with the Future. And so my question to you is, if there were a future that you could fall in love with that includes games, what does that future look like for you?
Hmm.
You're talking about hope, right?
Yeah,
And like when you're talking about the future, getting people to fall in love with the future is fundamentally about hope. You have to reach for something ahead of you with the people around you. Fundamentally, I think that is hope.
it is. There was a Disney movie that came out some years ago based on the Tomorrowland ride. oddly enough called Tomorrowland. It did very poorly, uh,
Yeah.
but it was a great movie with a complex idea, which is at the beginning of it. There's this kid who's at school and she's hearing about all the things that are wrong, the inevitable apocalypse, the environmental disasters, and her question is, so what are we going to do about it? And all of her teachers just kind of freeze up at that question because the idea that you can do something about it uh, is just blows their mind, right? And like in a sense, like I was saying earlier, there's a limit to how much reach we have. I'm I'm a professor. I have my students, and that is and occasionally people play my games. But any little bit that I can do makes a difference. The
Absolutely.
effort, the effort of putting something out there ideally inspires other people, ideally inspires other people. So in terms of reaching for the future, the two things I would say about that is one, I'm always looking for that point as a teacher where a student does something that I could not have thought of, that I never thought of, that just makes me question things. Um, and it's what I love about other game designers, about playing, about everything, about conversations like this. I love, how can I put this? I hate being wrong and I love being wrong. Like I love that. I love being surprised by the explosion of potential that I never suspected. Um, and so the future I want is where it, in that sense is one I can't see, but it's also one where people are willing to believe that they have that potential, that they can exceed, that they can do more than they would have thought, or at least are willing to try. And the other thing I'd say about that is the nature of the future is that it is always becoming, right? There's a art education guru named Rita Irwin who created this thing called artography, and she says always be becoming, and that's the nature of it, right? It's always in motion. Uh, Even if you reached a utopia, it couldn't be a utopia because, for one thing, it wouldn't be the utopia for everyone there. It could only be the utopia for whoever first designed it, and then you reach it. If it stagnates, then it's dead. So it's got to be fluid. Um, so for me to love the future, that future needs the fluidity because it needs to be, in a sense, impermanent. If it was the future I imagined, it couldn't be perfect. Um, but also a future that the people who live in it are invested in and who want to see what comes next.
The so funny because I've only done like 10 episodes of this podcast, and I started out with this like very central thesis that was like I'm going to talk about joy, and I'm going to talk, and I want to talk to people who are inspired by games, and it's going to turn into these conversations possibly about the creative process or something like that. I I I wanted to do this podcast when I read The Beauty of Games by Frank Lance. I ran around my room like 10 times after I read that book, and I was like, I got to do something with all of this energy. I'm going to lose my mind. I want to talk to people about what makes me want to lose my mind. This is so amazing. And I do talk about joy so often, and I want to talk about the future, and I want to talk about how we build systems that create a future that is fundamentally always becoming. And it seems to me like if you want a future that is always becoming, live action role playing is the perfect thing to want to study for the rest of your life, because it is that thing that is consistently becoming and also vanishing as it happens. And isn't that just like the most fundamental concept of what the future could be? It is the thing that vanishes as it happens and is constantly becoming.
It is a tricky thing to document, but yes, it is. I mean, that exact potential is why it's sometimes hard to get people into it. It's got a you should have been there. And there's also inevitably a feeling of the fear of missing out. Because, like I said, any given game is those people, that time, that place. You weren't there. Um, I've written a fair amount, if you ever want to dive into my academic work, about documentation of LARP.
Absolutely, I would.
Yeah, I won't stop you. Let me know. I'll send you articles. But one of my observations is that generally, when you see that, it's almost always so. A lot of LARP is assembled with a what I might call an arborescent idea. There's this big central trunk of a plot that's the main plot,
Cool.
and then have all the other characters that are the branches and the twigs. Um, and it's very linear in that sense. Whole lot easier to write. And when a designer documents it, or production company or what have you, they'll foreground that central plot. And they're like, this is the story, but it's not. The story is all those other things, right? It's it's the playlist somebody put together to try to understand their character. It's the letters that they scrawled in the darkness. Uh, it's the bruises that they got when they threw themselves a little bit too hard to the ground.
Yeah.
The player impacts are what matters so much more. The journaling and everything else like that. Janaea Kemper writes a lot about that also. She calls it emancipatory bleed. Uh,
Yeah.
but my interest in it isn't solely about the bleed. It's also about how we understand these things. So if you go into a museum about a significant event, let's say the Civil War, you could go into a museum that talks about where the soldiers moved to, who died, what happened, in very specific tactical historical terms. And it will not do very well in that museum. Uh, what you want is the letter that's like, Dear Clara, we have been down by the river for the last 2 weeks. The human element that makes it seem real. That story matters a whole lot more. When you get into historical fiction, the reason historical fiction sells is, well, it provides context. It provides the humanity. It provides the understanding, the feeling that it's something real. And so when I'm talking about documentation of LARP, I'm typically looking at a much more diasporic understanding, which you can probably tell again if you've ever played 500-Year-Old Vampire. um, so yeah, this kind of spread out thing, the making of meaning. Um, I'd also played in a very intense short version of a LARP called Say a Little Prayer, which right before we played it, somebody gave me their shawl to use as a costume, and I was the only person who had access to that. So my character in this was a drag queen, uh, and I think I may have been the only straight player in this particular group, which was, um, but for the context of the game, my character believed that they were beautiful, and everyone else treated me that way too. Which, to be honest, not how I normally feel. But for the length of the game, I was beautiful, I was conceited, I was narcissistic, I was amazing. I was the best performer. And in my hands, the shawl was. It was a shawl, it was a scarf, it was a blanket when I had drunk too much and I was sleeping it off the next day. It it was a piece of costume that served numerous causes. And I only had it because my friend threw me this shawl right before we started playing. Um, and it just ended up being central to my experience of the game.
Do you find that there is a particular joy in I kind of want to say the power structure of knowing that you are both the player and the audience during the game?
No, so we sometimes call that the first person audience, right? I don't know if yeah, but of course you've heard that term. Uh, and it also gets a little stranger when you're a designer too. Um, like
Because I
I
could see being very greedy about the fact that you are fundamentally like in the thing that becomes itself,
yeah,
there is power in partaking,
yeah,
right? So
it can be
as the
tricky.
thing,
Yeah,
yeah, as it disappears, you retain the power of being present.
yeah. There's James G writes about this a little bit, but he's talking more about computer role playing games as a kind of hybrid identity, the player, the character, and then this kind of hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've found is that it's not a solid set of identities. The way we talk about there, it seems to be one, two, or three, and then sometimes it'll be like, no, my immersion, but it's not really you're immersed or you're not immersed. It's there's always a sliding scale. Um, and there's some things that won't necessarily hit you until later when the LARP drop hits. Uh,
Sure.
and there have been points where I thought I was fine and then discovered I wasn't on the car ride home.
Mm-hmm.
And the it is empowering to be the person that's there and to be chewing the scenery and living in that moment. Um, it's also empowering. I've been playing a couple of games that have been run by Grimoire Productions, and they do a play to lift philosophy where you're sure you've got the spotlight, but also you want to give someone else the moments their character is angling for. If your character is villainous, be truly villainous. They need that villain to hate. If they're villainous, hate them. They're asking for it. And if you're concerned, you step out of character. Um, you it's not even that it's just the first person. It's this bubbling massive community of people that are taking the swings and then encouraging them to shoot for more, to see what'll happen, to be amazed by what they do, uh, to drop out of character for just a couple of seconds and go, "That was so cool," uh, you know, and I'd say that's one of the reasons that the "you had to be there" thing persists, is because of these moments that you share with people. And I will say, like, the intensity of those experiences have their ups and downs. Like in my case, I tend to trust very easily. And I have these intense experiences with people that I barely know, and all of a sudden we're out of character. I'm like, sure, I trust you. I'll tell you all the things. And I'm a very trusting person, and it can complicate relationships, as I'm sure that you've heard. But at the same time, one of the capabilities it has is showing us aspects of ourselves that we may have been unaware of, that we may have tried to hide from, that maybe we didn't even value enough about ourselves. Uh, I played one game where I didn't realize until shortly before the game that I wanted to play the character like Uncle Iroh from Avatar. And you know, there's that meme you see where be the person Uncle Iroh wants you to be. And it was like, well, how can I be the Uncle Iroh wants me to be? And in some sense, again, as a teacher, like that is kind of who I want to be. The downside, of course, is then you'll encounter a Zuko who breaks your heart. but but it doesn't mean that you don't do it because it's the right thing to do. So
Zuko was redeemed. Is it a spoiler? Is it
I,
still a spoiler?
you know what? It's been out for a while. I think it's okay.
I feel like it's been a decade at least.
You know
Anyway,
what? He walked up
but
right to the line of redemption and then backed off of it enough times. I
just
think people still, yeah.
yeah. Uh, but there is, I think, I think that the thing that that I do deeply find so intoxicating about role playing games in general is that you do enter this state of free fall with other people. Um, and you can choose the level of vulnerability that applies to someone that is not necessarily you, but is also absolutely you, without a doubt. And it does put you in situations, absolutely, where you end up trusting people sort of like beyond your own comprehension because you're being someone else at the time, and you're I've thought often how different it actually is from acting, and I won't get into a whole theater spiral, but there is a level of um, vulnerability in the fact that it is unrehearsed for the most part. I think
Hmm.
that puts it in a different place of vulnerability because you are, I guess, your motivations are your own. They're generated by your own experience of how you want to interact with the rules of the game, because when you're rehearsing a play or you're in theater, the rules of the game stay pretty much the same, but it doesn't sound like you're always playing the same game with the people who are playing the game with you when you are all trying to learn something different at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, the within LARP, it opens up a super wide range of things. I mean, so for one thing, there are a lot of people who come at LARP and role playing as theater. Um, it is not, in my opinion, fundamentally. There are people who do not agree with me. There are not a lot of. I just don't agree. like one of the reasons
Fair.
I don't agree, like for one thing, the audience terminology aside, one of the reasons we use theater terms and framing terms is because it's the closest thing we have to being able to understand it. When stage started moving into film, they had the same thing. And eventually film developed its own vocabulary, its own taxonomy. Film into TV or really any given medium. Like we start with what's familiar, but it's not the same. And like if I talk about tabletop role playing is only improv for people who engage with tabletop role playing as improv. And I know people who do not. I know people who are there for tactical combat that don't do
Correct.
voices that like for them
There
that
are
is
two
not
games happening at
yeah,
once.
that's not what it is. Uh I'd say same thing with LARP. Certainly there's improv elements, but I've played a number of LARPs where if the point is for me to put on a performance as a character, I do not do a great job. If the point is for me to learn something about myself or the world, I do a great job. And what makes a successful LARP is not necessarily the audience. There are LARPs where it does actually matter if the imaginary viewing audience at home is satisfied. But in a general sense, that's that's not what you're there for.
Maybe too philosophical a question, but I mean,
There's no such thing as too philosophical to be.
okay. Phenomenal. That's also how I feel. I'm glad you feel that way too. Um, do you find that we we have or that we need a lexicon to essentially emerge about what in my mind is not theater, but is in essence a, a essentially an imagined experience of reality, right? You are
Shared
essentially trying on
hallucination.
it.
Yeah.
You are you are not reading a book, but you are hallucinating vividly.
Mhm.
Uh, you do you do you find that we are creating verbiage for that, or even if we were to do that in the most 1970s theory way, is the verbiage even sufficient for do we even have the capacity to understand a limitlessness with the colonized language that we currently possess?
That's a fair point too. Well, so there's a combination of things there. There is absolutely verbiage that is specific to it, but it's mainly talked about either within design communities or amongst academics. And so there's several academics like me, some who've been at this longer. If you haven't talked to, if I start naming names, someone will be upset that I leave them out. I'll give you a grand list of names later,
Phenomenal.
but yeah, there's a number of academics, and then if you were to ever go to say BCon or Intercon like that, where the designers are, they've developed kind of terminology that they use. Um, there's an upside and a downside to that. And terminology is only as effective as you're all being able to understand the concept, that you're all speaking of the same thing. Within game studies, one of the problems that we actually have is that most game studies people are games plus something else. So when we use terms like liminal or triangulating, like it doesn't actually mean the same thing in every discipline. So from
Sure.
psychology to anthropology to English to theater, like so it can be a little bit tricky. And one of the things that brings us together is our writing for the publications that exist, right? But the nature of that lingo is that it also keeps people out of the conversation if they don't know the terms, if they're not in the know. Uh, and it is one of the reasons that I really enjoy having downtime conversations with people in between sections of playing at a LARP or afterwards. Um, I love to talk to people and find out what they thought and what they experienced, um, and it's a great conversation. Because, like I said, for me, part of the point is the reflection. I have occasionally played with people who play a game, say that was just a game, and then they don't believe that the themes touch on their life. They don't believe that I've played with people who then afterward denied the essential humanity of some of the people that they just played a game with, which was heartbreaking. And that goes back to the trust thing, right? Because you can't play specifically LARP without trust. Uh, but even in tabletop, there's and in some sense, you were talking about the roles earlier, and I've talked about it like when I'm at a table, I'm a drama club person. I chew the scenery, but you want a rules lawyer there. It helps to have them. You want the support player. You even want the person who wants to be the quarterback, the the person going for the thing, because in some sense they tend to be very good at the tactics when you're playing tabletop. The diversity of players is part of the point, and I think that, like I said earlier, we all tend to design for ourselves. And when we start playing, our assumption is every player is like ourselves too. And it can be frustrating sometimes when they are not. But on the whole, I would say that is the great joy of it. Um, 80% of the time.
Sure. I
Yeah.
mean, if there is anything that I think is foundational to games, it is that they are absolutely an art form and part of like deeply foundational human culture. Um, but no one wants to wear my poem like a skirt. And people will do that to a game. It's the level at which we um form a relationship with a game is at a fundamentally different level than most other art forms, in my opinion.
Yeah.
um because you can love a poem, you can tattoo it on your body, you cannot live inside of it, and you can in some form live inside of a game, uh depending.
Yeah.
Caveats.
I think that there are people who have attempted to live in a poem.
Yes.
In that sense, they may be living in the game. I've I've also thought a lot about games that. So I mentioned earlier the short, sharp shock approach to
Hmm.
specifically freeform gaming, as opposed to, say, any kind of campaign game. But some games also benefit by system mastery, right? So D&D and Pathfinder being the best known role-playing games probably in the
Yes.
world. D&D system mastery in D&D means you're aware of where it's broken and you can abuse it.
Really.
Uh, so that's
And you will.
and you will. Like that's part of the joy of D&D, of feeling very smart, is figuring out where some kind of funny rules thing lets you do something interesting, right? Um, Pathfinder has a few areas like that. You can stumble into them if you're not careful, although it is a much more tightly balanced game. But to some degree, the system mastery in Pathfinder isn't really about abusing that. Um, it
No, it's
tends,
much more harnessable.
yeah, but it is, their lore is a known quantity. You can know all the lore of Pathfinder. The more you play of Pathfinder, the more you know Pathfinder. If you're in the Pathfinder Society, you unlock additional options. Uh, Pathfinder wants system mastery because that's part of the world that it occupies. It wants you to explore and occupy that world. I am personally more a fan of games that allow me to help co-create that world. I prefer indie role-playing games mostly. Um, they are, trickier to find players for sometimes, but the nature of it is always I'd say the nature of any given game and most interactions is always a tension between structure and agency. Uh, and some of them encourage a lot more agency than others. But I've also found that for some people, too much agency can freeze you up, can make it so you don't
Sure.
feel like you
Yeah.
have any options. So, it's a fun thing to play with, and to calibrate for the players that you're with.
Yeah. The human element, quote unquote, the human element can be something that folks who have too much agency don't want,
Yeah,
uh, which is also possibly how you get your heart broken playing
that is
D&D.
also true. Uh, one of the one of the things that I've been talking to people about, like I'm trying to figure out how this character is meant to be played. I'm like, however you play, it's how it's meant to be played. Uh,
Exactly.
Pre-generated characters and LARP characters, they're like comic book characters. They were written by a creator. You are the current comic book writer. Whatever you do with them is canon. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yep.
Yeah, the The other thing that I have found is that more and more games that I am seeing be created um, are focused on the value of the byproduct that the game creates, right? You write letters to your friends, you have mementos. There is this, and in in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, the thing you create is the character over iterations of time. The byproduct is the iterative, is the little trinket that we as humans must possess.
Mm-hmm.
We need some sort of and that is another reason why I feel that games are so fundamental to human culture, because they offer us memory. They hand us this, like, and you did it, and you can prove it, and you can tell the story about it, and here's the memory of it. Like, we can, and it seems like, especially with solo games, solo RPGs, etc., the memories that are contained therein form this byproduct that is also the product
Yeah, it forms an
of
artifact. Yeah.
whatever playing it. Yes, it is your historical evidence of having experienced it. um I want to ask you one more question, and that would be, um sort of a cop out, but if what is one question you wish someone would ask you?
Oh, dang. Hmm. In all honesty, it would be, are you free to play a game with me? Because most
Phenomenal.
of the time I would, that's what I'm always looking for.
Yeah, fair. That's awesome. What a great answer. um Well, phenomenal, everyone. Uh, this has been such a joy, literally. Dr. Cox, thank you so much for being here. Um, I have enjoyed this so immensely. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm Jackie Harris, and I hope the joy sticks. Bye.